The Easter Rising of 1916 was a defining moment in Irish history, a week in which a few thousand visionaries took up arms in Dublin against imperial rule and declared an independent republic of equals.
You're again basically right in the heart of what the battlefield would have been 100 years ago. That tall office building over behind me, that's of course the modern Liberty Hall, but 100 years ago that was the home of the Irish Trades and General Workers Union, the Irish Women's Workers Union and the Irish Citizen Army.
Brutally suppressed by the British and followed by a deadly civil war, the 1916 Rising led to national independence for the South and the division of the country, with the more industrial North remaining under British rule. Sinn Fein, founded in 1905, has been dedicated ever since to the creation of a united Irish Republic.
It was 100 years ago, on Easter Monday 1916, in the centre of Dublin, when a small band of revolutionaries proclaimed an independent Irish Republic. This group of poorly equipped Irish men and women took on the might of the largest empire the world had ever seen. It was an empire built on conquest, exploitation, brute force and repression. Following 6 days of heroic resistance, the centre of Dublin lay in ruins. The leaders met for the last time in 16 Moore Street and ordered a surrender. They were court-martialed by the British. 14 were executed in the Stonebreakers Yard and Canmailum prison. Thomas Keogh was executed in Cork and Roger Casement was hanged in London.
What's historically significant about 1916 is it was one of those turning points in our national history. It was genuinely the birth of modern Ireland as we understand it today.
You know, there's two periods then that stood out. One was 1798, which was the birth of the United Irish movement, and the second was 1916, and the Easter Rising. And to people, the likes of myself, it was unbelievable.
You know, I associate the ideals of 1916 and what was being fought for, a break from imperialism, as important, because it was a break from imperialism and there was a whole set of values that underpinned the idea of the kind of society that James Connolly and his comrades were fighting for.
I think there's huge parallels. If you consider that, say, James Connolly, for example, talked about the issues that sort of were in the background in Dublin at that time, he very much rallied around what he called the rack-renting, slum-owning landlords. And here we have a huge problem in that way now with landlordism, particularly the big vulture funds, many of them from the United States, who've bought up huge blocks of Ireland and rental property and are operating effectively as a cartel, which is driving people out of their homes.
100 years after the Rising of 1916, the question of sovereignty is very much on people's minds today. Not only because of the division of the island, but also because of what the Irish have experienced at the hands of global capital.
Ireland became, in a way, the poster child of neoliberal globalization. You know, it was the model to be followed because it apparently was this miracle. I mean, you know, it showed that actually neoliberal globalization could work and could work for small countries. It wasn't just about the big, huge powers, and here was little Ireland, which had been a basket case economy. And suddenly it was, by some calculations, you know, becoming one of the richest countries in the world. And Ireland was being used. I mean, I don't know if you remember, even in the American presidential elections, I mean, John McCain was citing Ireland as the example for the United States to follow. And what did they mean by Ireland? What they meant was that Ireland showed that if you cut taxes and you deregulated everything, then the economy would naturally become this fantastically rapidly growing one, which had wealth for everybody and could then solve all of the historical problems of Ireland would be over.
Fintan O'Toole wrote a book on Ireland's financial crash called Ship of Fools: How Stupidity and Corruption Sank the Celtic Tiger.
I think 2016 has been really very interesting because, you know, you could look at it and say, oh, it's all just nostalgia for the past. And so, yeah, of course there's some nostalgia in it. And of course there's also some sense that people are desperately trying to get back to some idea of Irish sovereignty. I mean, a very simple thing. You know, what was the Irish Revolution about? It was about just asserting Irish sovereignty. And that sovereignty was completely lost in 2010 the international institutions came in and took charge of Ireland. You know, they really did.
We're actually going back in time now, from a period when maybe in the 60s and 70s, people growing up then had a reasonable expectation for a right to a permanent job, they could access accommodation and so on. Now a permanent job is becoming a thing of the past. The jobs that are being created are incredibly casual in their nature, 0-hour contracts, people being on the end of the phone waiting for a phone call. I want you today, no, you can do 2 hours tomorrow, come back. That's the type of employment.
Since the collapse of both the property boom and the financial sector, we've had, Irish society has been ravaged by choices that were made by a political elite, influenced obviously by the interests of the banking and financial elite, and those choices that were made by them were to impose the cost of risks that were taken by bankers and developers and corrupt politicians, and to impose those costs on the people of Ireland. And the people of Ireland, to say that they have suffered greatly is an absolute understatement.
Teachers have taken to having to bring in extra lunches themselves in order to feed the children, because these schools wouldn't be given any deprived status. That has stopped over the last number of years, so they're not getting any recognition or assistance in that regard. We've had the reopening of soup kitchens, obviously something which Countess Markievicz in her day had rolled up her sleeves and operated in this city, and here we are, they've returned, and there are literally hundreds of people queuing up at night to get a hot meal from those facilities. So they would generally, it wouldn't be just the people who are homeless, and behind many a respectable front door where it looks good on the outside in a nice estate with a car, there's people who are really struggling and finding it very, very difficult to manage.
I have 3 kids. We have Molly, who's 8, Noah, who's 5, and Daryl, who's 2. And they're mad, crazy little bunch of dudes. But I love them to bits.
I'm actually in a B&B at the minute because obviously I had to present myself homeless, but because of all the stress, I had another baby during that, so that was 2 babies, and because of all the stress, Dad got up and left me, so I was on my own with 2 kids facing homeless.
Aisling and Rachel work with an anti-eviction group called the Irish Housing Network.
Matthew's only young, so he doesn't really know because he's nearly 3, but currently she's 5, she knows. But she knows that she's homeless, but she knows that she will get a house. So, yeah, her behaviour's changed. She used to be good.
The reality is, for myself and Rachel, there is no recovery. At the moment, like, there's no way out for us. I mean, the bankers and the rich, they're having a grand old time with their recovery, but the normal people aren't. We haven't felt a recovery, and we can't actually see a recovery. So when I had Molly, I was in an apartment, and then because the family was getting bigger, we moved to a bigger house. So yeah, we've always had a nice home. I got it through rent allowance, which the government helped me pay, and then I'd make up the rest every month myself. When we went looking for other houses, we were shocked at the prices, because when we moved into the house, our house first, like the rents were only like £1,000 a month, and then we were like, whoa, 1,600, 1,500, 1,600 a month, and we knew there was no way we'd be able to afford. I was told actually 2 weeks before Christmas 2014 by the landlord he was selling, and then 5 months later the house got sold. So in 5 months, and we couldn't for the life of us find anyway. I told the kids we were going on an adventure, and at the end of the adventure we'd have our own house where we didn't have to give the landlord any more monies. So that's what I told them.
The activist response over the years has been phenomenal. I mean, you know, it's been slow, but it has been phenomenal, and it has culminated, I think, in the absolutely amazing resistance that we have seen to the introduction of the water charges.
We're all aware of the reasons for these charges. In 2008, this country was brought to its knees. The Irish people are finished paying.
Personally speaking, I have never been on a shit water charges protest. Ever. Yeah? The media might portray it as that, but I can guarantee you that the people who matter, the decision makers, the mainstream parties, the candidates in the general elections, they knew that there was a major protest on the streets in Dublin City days before the election. But the people who needed to hear it, we could be absolutely sure that they were rattling in different circles.
Hundreds of thousands of people engaged in protest action, which touched on way more than water. It was really about the way in which Irish society was being organised, the fact that the last government had no democratic mandate to bring in charges, and yet it did. And people kind of got off their knees and liked it when they did. I mean, Jim Larkin's catchphrase was always "the great appear great only because we are on our knees, let us rise." And people in Ireland did rise against austerity over the past number of years, and when they were off the knees they kind of thought, well, you know, we kind of like this actually, we'll do a bit more.
We are the residents of Terrorist Action Group. We are here to tell the government to save us from the vulture front. They're about to chase us out of our homes. Most of us has lived in the house for 8.5 years. We're a big community with much culture. Most of us got an eviction letter to leave the houses by the end of this year. And the Dublin West have a large number of the homeless crisis. So the government needs to come to our rescue and put up an affordable scheme. So those that on housing allowance can be able to rent, those that private renting can be able to buy in future.
Huge mobilisation on the streets, huge pressure put on the government, huge level of cooperation between community sector, trade unions and political parties. But what they then did, which was really important, was they launched this Right to Change movement, which is made up of 3 pillars. Party political pillar, everybody who signed up to a common set of policy principles. The trade union pillar, the same. And then what they called the community pillar, which was all those non-party political, non-affiliated community-based organisations in the 26 counties. There's been a lot of good conferences, there's been a lot of good dialogue, a lot of good mobilisations. And while again that's at quite an embryonic stage, it is certainly the most advanced moment of kind of cooperation between the different spheres of kind of the broad Irish progressive space than we've seen in a long time.
The recent general election was one of the more interesting in our history. I think we saw the continued fall in the support for the right-wing parties which dominated Irish politics for decades.
To desecrate this site with a shopping centre, what Philistines the political establishment are in this country. The truth is, they want to bury the revolutionary history of 1916.
Historically, they've had 80-90% of the Irish vote. That's been falling. It was about 80% maybe 10 years ago. Now it's gone to below 50, or in and around the 50 mark, which is absolutely huge. Now, I suppose what isn't as clear is where has that vote gone, and I suppose there's no clear home that can hoover it all up.
The 5 West Belfast candidates are Francis McCann, aka Fra, known to you all, Patrick Sheehan, Rosie McCorley, Alex Maskey and Jennifer McCann.
After years of partition and armed combat culminating in the occupation of Northern Ireland by British troops, the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 established a regional government for the North. Men and women who were once imprisoned or on the run are now running for office, including these members of Sinn Fein.
She's my granddaughter. The love of my life.
Fra McCann was one of many young men interned without charge after the arrival of British troops in the 1970s. In 1976, when he was still in his teens, he was arrested and charged with membership in the nationalist Irish Republican Army.
I spent most of my time on what became known as the blanket protest, which was the British government had introduced, had ended political status from March 1976, and their attempt to criminalise Republican prisoners. A friend of mine, Kieran Nugent, was sentenced and refused to wear the prison uniform. And the name blanket came about purely because he was naked in a cell, and the prison warder at the time had threw a blanket into the cell and said, if you're not wearing a uniform, that's the only thing that you'll get. So thus the blanket protest. The name for the blanket protest was born. It was a very brutal protest during which very, very, very difficult strip searching was done, internal searches, table searches, mirror searches, which meant you were bent naked over a table or over a mirror, and your back passage, your back side was pulled open, and they probed that there. And if you refused to obey them, which we did, you were badly beaten.
Emma Groves was born in 1976, the same year McCann was arrested. She grew up in an activist Republican nationalist family in the Andersontown area of Belfast during the height of the so-called Troubles.
To me, it just seemed normal that was normal life. So growing up, it was quite hard. You were restricted to where you could go in certain areas. You were restricted even in the city centre. You would have to be careful of making friends with people from a different religion. You know, it was all... I think I spent my childhood, and only looking back on it now, nearly on eggshells. You know, you needed to be careful going into certain areas. You need to be careful that if there was a rat broke out, if you're at the shop, have you somewhere? Do you know where to run to? Do you know how to hide? Do you know, those sort of things, just to try and make yourself safe for a simple thing of going to the shop.
I had 7 children, and I have to say, pre-having the kids and getting married, growing up in Belfast was amazing. And that's I think I found that quite hurtful for my own kids. If you were picking them up out of school, you know, making sure that they stayed together, that you didn't leave yourself open to an army Saracen suddenly roaring up the footpath. That might sound silly, but making them walk in single file close to the pram, or, you know, that sort of thing. Never allowing them to stray very far from you. If you had to go into town, organising babysitters, you just did not take them into the centre of the city. You could get yourself home, but you couldn't get 7 children home.
Who fears to speak of Easter week, that week of Fein now? When the boys and girls went out to fight the forces of the crown, with Mausers bold and hearts of gold, the red countess dressed in green, and high above the jeep